Hey everyone, and welcome to The Explainer. Today, we are digging into a really fascinating report called The Hidden Crisis. And it argues that there's this huge kind of under-the-radar shift happening in the nonprofit world, all thanks to a series of executive orders that are completely rewriting the rules for how our community services get funded.
The report kicks things off with this quote, and wow, it really sets the stage. The whole idea here is that while we're all looking at the big flashy headlines, something really fundamental is changing in the background, something that could have massive consequences for all of us.
So to get a sense of what's really at stake here, look at this number, 12.3 million. That's how many people work in the U.S. nonprofit sector. The report points out that's more jobs than in construction and manufacturing put together. So we're not just talking about small charities. This is a huge piece of our economy, and really, the glue that holds a lot of our communities together.
All right, Section 1 of the report, A Quiet Revolution. This is where the author lays out the core problem, a systematic re-engineering of federal grants, done not through legislation, but through executive orders.
The report breaks these changes down into two big waves. The first wave kind of laid the groundwork, introducing all these new rules around accountability. But it's the second wave, from 2024 to 2025, that the report says really accelerated everything and changed the entire philosophy of who gets money and why. Let's see how.
So, let's dive into Section 2, Rewriting the Rules. We're going to start with that first wave of changes, the ones that were all framed around making things more accountable.
The report calls this the compliance trap. What used to be a pretty standard application process suddenly became this just bureaucratic nightmare. All of a sudden, you needed expensive lawyers, special software, even dedicated staff just to handle the paperwork. And for smaller, grassroots nonprofits, they just couldn't keep up.
And that created what the author calls the advocacy paradox. This is where things get really tricky. Totally normal, nonpartisan work, like, say, a voter registration drive or publishing a report on water quality, was suddenly getting flagged as politically suspect. You can imagine the chilling effect that had. Organizations got scared to do their core mission because they were afraid they'd lose their funding.
Now, that second wave, according to the report, took things a huge step further. The philosophy for awarding grants shifted. It went from being about merit and proven results to what the author labels ideological gatekeeping. Suddenly, it was all about mission alignment with the current administration's goals. And they even put political appointees on the panels that decided who got the money.
And on top of all that, there was this change that the report calls the stability killer. Those stable, multi-year grants that let nonprofits actually plan for the future? Gone. They were almost all replaced with 12-month funding cycles. I mean, can you imagine trying to run a long-term project or even just keep your staff when you have no idea if you'll have any money in a year? It made any kind of long-term planning basically impossible.
Okay, so what was the result of all these new rules? Well, that brings us to Section 3, the domino effect. The report argues these changes set off a devastating chain reaction that rippled through communities all over the country.
And this chart just lays it out perfectly. The average nonprofit is now spending almost a third of its grant money, 31%, just on administration. That's up from only 12% just 5 years ago. That is a huge chunk of money that's not going to food pantries or job training or mental health services anymore. It's going to paperwork.
The report is also really clear that this pain was not spread around equally, not at all. Organizations serving rural areas, BIPOC-led groups, and immigrant services saw their funding plummet. And for groups supporting the LGBTQ+ community, federal funding, according to the report, was pretty much wiped out entirely.
And this created a massive crisis for the people who do this work. Staff turnover just skyrocketed. Experienced, talented people got tired of the constant instability and just left for the private sector. The report warns that we're now seeing a whole generation of young, talented people avoiding nonprofit work, and all that institutional knowledge, decades of it, is just walking out the door.
All right, Section 4. This is where the report moves from the what to the why. So what was the motivation behind all these policies? Now, it's really important to say what we're about to cover is the author's interpretation of the strategy here. This is the report's analysis.
According to the author, none of this was an accident. It was a deliberate strategy. The goals, as the report sees them, were to centralize power, to shrink the social safety net, to silence any groups that might challenge government policy, and to reward groups that were ideologically aligned with the administration, all while nudging communities to rely on for-profit companies for services they used to get from nonprofits.
So after all that, you're probably wondering if there's any hope. Well, the report doesn't just diagnose the problem. The final section is all about fighting back, laying out a framework for how the nonprofit sector can actually respond.
It offers this really concrete three-step plan for what to do right now. First, do an audit to figure out what federal funding is really costing you in time and money. Second, go on a sprint to find other sources of funding. And third, build coalitions. Team up with other local groups to share resources and fight back together.
And then for the long haul, the focus shifts to bigger picture stuff. Things like building up financial reserves so you can weather these storms, and then pushing for major sector-wide reform through the courts, through new laws, and just by making the public aware that this is even happening.
And to just put a fine point on how high the stakes are, the report's surveys paint a really stark picture. 87% of nonprofits say it's gotten way harder to get funding. 61% have already had to cut back on their services. And the most shocking one, 43%, nearly half, are actually thinking about closing their doors for good within the next 2 years.
And that leaves us with the final, critical question that the report poses. You know, this isn't just about dollars and cents or bureaucracy. It's about the very health of our society. What happens when the very infrastructure holding our communities together is intentionally put at risk?
But the author doesn't end with the question. They end with this call to action. It's this powerful reminder that, at the end of the day, real power doesn't just sit in government buildings, it belongs to the people. It's a message of hope and resilience, and that's where we'll leave our explainer for today. Thanks so much for tuning in.